In this video, I wanted to take just a minute to talk a little bit about errors. Hopefully everybody who's watching this video has done at least a little bit of programming before in JavaScript, if nothing else. And in that previous programming experience, you probably realized that the errors that can occur while you're doing your programming can pretty much be put into two different groups. First of all, we have logic errors. Logic errors are when we're doing everything in the language correctly. We're using the syntax of the language correctly, but what we're actually asking the program to do is not actually achieving our desired results. Logic errors tend to be the more difficult type to diagnose, the more difficult type to fix, because they are not explicit errors. They're not usually going to result in actual error messages appearing on the computer screen, or in our case, in the web browser. The second type of error message that can occur, though, or the second type of error that can occur, is syntax errors. These are the errors that result simply from doing the wrong thing, from using the language in the wrong way, from not following the rules of the language, essentially. And that's the type of error that I wanted to talk about here in this video real quickly. In PHP, when we do things wrong with the syntax, that can of course cause problems to occur. When we send a request for the file, PHP tries to actually execute the file, but if there are syntax errors, PHP of course isn't going to be able to execute the file as we plan. For example, I have a simple little PHP script here. If you look at it closely, you can probably just right off the bat spot some things that I've done wrong. And if I jump over to my web browser and actually take a look at the result of running this script, you can see, sure enough, the page is not at all showing up the way that we would normally expect it to. In this case, we're actually getting one of PHP's error messages back, and anytime there's something wrong syntactically with a PHP script you write and you get an error like this, first and foremost, the most important thing you can do to help resolve this error is to read the error message. It might sound kind of silly, but I've seen a million times people who see that there is an error but don't actually pay any attention to what it is that it says. They instead just jump right back to their code and start manually searching for what the problem is. I can understand that inclination because the error messages that you get are not always terribly helpful, but they at least usually give you a little bit of a starting idea of what's wrong and where you might want to look for it. Here in this particular case, PHP is coming back and telling me I have a parse error, basically a syntax error. There's something wrong with the way that I've written the PHP code, and the PHP server is unable to read it and understand it. What this error is actually saying is that it's expecting to see a comma or a semicolon somewhere. That's helpful. That gives me an idea of what I might want to look for. It tells me what file the error actually occurs in. Again, that's very helpful. It might even seem a little bit silly at this point, since our scripts at this point are just single files. But later, when we have scripts that require other scripts that require other scripts, looking at the actual name of the file where the error occurred can actually be very useful. It also there at the end of the error message mentions that the error occurred on line 22. So with all that knowledge in mind, if I now jump back over to my script, I can start looking for what the problem might be. And in this case, it says line 22, which is this line here. And it says that I'm missing a semicolon, but that's not right. I've got a semicolon right there at the end of that line. But if I look one line above, sure enough, there is a missing semicolon on that line. The PHP compiler, of course, like everything, is just another dumb piece of software. It does the best that it can, but it's nowhere near as intelligent or intuitive as a human being can be. So when it points us to a particular line, there's a chance the error may actually be on that line, but there's also a very real chance that it won't be, right? In this case, it obviously was off by a line. Let me go ahead and put in the semicolon there on the line preceding it, line 21. I'll jump back over to my browser and refresh. And that error goes away, but it is then immediately replaced by another error. I broke this script really well. Now it's just telling me there's a parse error, but it doesn't give me any other details. I can see it's in the same file, and now it's saying it's on line 23. If I jump back over to my script, take a look at line 23, I don't actually see anything wrong with that line. I see a semicolon, I see a valid echo command, I see a balanced set of quotes. Everything there looks good. But again, if I look around in the vicinity, often the line before, on this line I see a semicolon, I see an echo command, but I see an unbalanced set of quotes. I have an opening single quote here, but I don't see a matching single quote at the end. Let me try dropping that in and see if that fixes it. Back to the browser, refresh, and hey, I think that did it. I'm not actually seeing any error messages now, so my script works, right? Well, not exactly. Looking at the actual output I am getting at this point, it still doesn't look exactly like what I expected. What I expected to see was my header at the top, the words "this is a paragraph," and then an ordered list of 1, 2, 3. But I'm seeing almost what looks like some PHP code scattered throughout here in different places. Now, almost guaranteed, anytime you see actual PHP code showing up in the browser, there's one of two things wrong. One is that your PHP server isn't running. I can tell that's not the case here because I'm not seeing my echo statements with the 1, 2, 3. So in this case, I'm thinking it must be the second problem. The second thing that could go wrong that could make PHP code actually show up in your browser is that you've forgotten your PHP tags or that your PHP tags are wrong. With that in mind, let's look at the code and see if that's what's going on. So for starters, here on line 17, on the line that's supposed to echo out a paragraph that says, "this is a paragraph," sure enough, I completely forgot the PHP tags around that line altogether. Let me go ahead and add those in, like that. If I go back to my browser and refresh, that fixed up half of it. "This is a paragraph" is now showing up just as a paragraph, no more PHP code around it. I do still have a little bit of something stuck here to the bottom though, quote, question mark, greater than. Almost looks like a closing PHP tag, doesn't it? It happens here after my list, 1, 2, 3, so let me go back to my source code and look at that area. What it looks like I have down there around the closing ordered list tag is a set of PHP tags where I'm echoing this out. This almost looks like what's being output, single quote, question mark, greater than. But why would that happen? Well, you've probably already spotted it. My opening PHP tag, I made a typo. I left off the closing P, or the last P in PHP. Let me put that back in there, back to the browser, refresh, and yes, I'm not seeing anything too strange now. I'm not seeing any error messages. I'm not seeing any weird PHP codes leaking through. Everything seems to be working okay. Well, still, not exactly. If I jump back over and I take a look up in the head section of my document, I have a little CSS section up here where I'm trying to set the font family for my body to Helvetica. That doesn't look like Helvetica to me. That looks like my default Times font. Why in the world would my font not be changing? Is it a CSS problem or is it something to do with PHP? Well, here's a little bit of a trick with PHP, something to keep in mind when you're debugging PHP scripts, and that's that the errors that PHP produces are often just considered content in the document, which means that sometimes when errors are produced in the body, they'll just show up as content in the body. When errors are produced up in the head section, they would just show up as content in the head section. And hopefully something you remember from previous previous HTML experience is that the head section is not meant for doing output. What we put into the head section of an HTML file is not typically displayed in the browser. So let me go back to my browser and let me pull up the source code that was downloaded from the PHP server. This is what we have. My body down here looks completely normal. The head section up here, though, something's a little bit strange. At the point in the head section where it's supposed to be saying Helvetica as my font family, instead I have a PHP error actually embedded there inside the CSS in the head section of my document. Right? So PHP errors might not necessarily always show up in the rendered page. Sometimes you actually have to go to the source code that was generated by your script on the server to be able to see all of your error messages. Here the error messages is telling me I have use of an undefined constant Helvetica. Well, we haven't talked about constants at all, but I bet if you go back and take a look, you can see what I did wrong here, and that's that I didn't actually echo this value. If I echo the value, put quotes around it, a semicolon never hurts. Go back to the browser and refresh again. There we go. Helvetica is showing up for my font. It's showing up in the actual output from the server. No more error messages. So at this point, I have a completely working script. So overall, the idea is when you make syntax errors in PHP, they're usually not too hard to track down. PHP will usually give you some kind of good error message. It might not always be exactly right, but it at least gives you a good idea of where to look. Read the error messages, try to follow what they say, but prepare to be flexible because they're a lot of times going to be off here or there. It takes a little bit of getting used to reading the error messages and understanding what they're trying to tell you. And always remember, if something doesn't look quite right, go back and look at the code that's being downloaded from the server, because hidden error messages that aren't actually being displayed in the content of the page, are also always a real possibility. One last thing here to mention about error messages is what happens if you write a PHP script and nothing shows up. No errors, no output, nothing at all. You just end up with a blank page there in your web browser. If that's the situation, most likely what has happened is that there is an error somewhere in your PHP script, but your PHP server is configured to not show the errors. PHP can definitely be configured to show no error output whatsoever. It's very often the configuration that you want for PHP when it's running in a production environment. Error messages can sometimes give away details about your app that you might not necessarily want other people to see. So very often when PHP scripts are run in a public production environment out on the live web itself, very often the servers are configured to show no error messages whatsoever. The copy of PHP you have set up on your own computer, though, to do development in probably is set up to show errors, but just in case you find yourself in a situation where you're expecting to see errors and none of the errors are showing up, I wanted to give you a little bit of a hint as to what to do. PHP has a configuration file that can be set up for it called php.ini. When you first install PHP, either on Windows or in OS X, chances are you probably don't even have one of these configuration files. Instead, PHP is just running with its default built-in values. If you want to be able to configure PHP to do something like turn errors on when they were previously turned off, what you need to do is you need to create one of these PHP.ini files for yourself, which is actually very easy to do. Both the Windows and the OS X copy of PHP actually do come with a default template for the PHP.ini file. If you're running on a Windows computer and you've installed PHP the way that I suggested in a previous video, then your copy of PHP should be installed on your C drive in a folder called PHP. And in that folder, you should then find a file called php.ini-development. That is the PHP.ini template that you can use. Similarly, on OS X, there will be a default template called php.ini.default, which will be in the private etc folder. You can see the path for it here on my screen. In both cases, whether you're on Windows or whether you're on OS X, what you want to do is you want to take that default template file and you want to make a copy of it, or rename it if you want to, and simply call it php.ini. Once you've done that, you can then go into that file, and there are a huge variety of different configuration options that you can configure and set for your PHP server. When it comes to displaying error messages or not, the two lines that you would want to change are the two that I have listed here. One says display errors, and the other one says error reporting. The display errors option can either be set to on or off. If you want to see errors, you of course set it to on. If you don't want to see errors, you set it to off. The error reporting option specifies what type of errors you want to see. When you're working in development, I would suggest that you want to see all possible errors. Anything that could potentially be wrong, you want to be able to see it. So you could set error reporting equal to E_all, which PHP will understand to mean all errors of any kind. Once you've actually made that change, or those changes possibly, and saved that PHP.ini file back, right, the last thing you would want to do is make sure you restart your server. On Windows, if PHP is already running, hit Control-C and then run your server again with the PHP-S localhost 3000 command. If you're running on OS X, then you would want to go out to a terminal and type sudo apache control, that's APACHECTL, and then the word restart. Once the server is actually restarted, or during the process of restarting, PHP will see that it has a configuration file, the PHP ini file, and will load itself according to whatever options are set in it. So when it reloads, you should at that point have error messages that show up. If your server is already showing you error messages, there's really at this point no reason to mess with the PHP ini file. But if by some chance defaults change and you find yourself unable to see error messages, this is the process you would want to do, the process you would want to go through in order to get those error messages back.